This is Dunkirk, the seaport on the northern coast of France. Today, there are few obvious reminders that it was once the scene of one of the great dramas of the Second World War, the so-called Miracle of Dunkirk, when an entire army was ferried to safety by an armada of British ships. The beaches stretch wide and pale under a quiet sky. Children play where soldiers once bled. The tide comes in and goes out, indifferent to what happened here, as tides always are. It was a glorious defeat that raised the spirits of the British nation but confirmed the superiority of the German army. And its story begins not with generals or politicians, but with two old men who have come back to remember. But more than 60 years after the events that made this place a byword for both catastrophe and deliverance, two old men have come back. One is English, one is German. In May and June of 1940, they were on opposite sides of one of the most desperate episodes of the war. Now, for the first time, they are walking these beaches together. Bob Pendleton was a signalman in the 46th Nottingham Division. Georg Lehrmann served in the 20th Artillery Regiment, one of the German units that pushed the British back through Belgium and France. The story of Dunkirk is often called a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But it was also a story of shame, of chaos, of heartbreak, and of choices that haunt the men who made them to this day. It is, above all, a story about what happens when ordinary people are caught in the machinery of war, and how some of them, against all odds, found a way out. On the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler's armies turned their attention to Western Europe. The Germans, using every means of attack at their disposal, had already crushed Poland, Norway, and Denmark. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry working in terrifying coordination, smashing through defenses before they could be organized, and racing ahead before anyone could react. It was a new kind of warfare, and the Allies were utterly unprepared for it. Now it was the turn of France, Belgium, and Holland to feel the full might of the German forces, led by the fearsome panzer divisions and supported from the air by the Luftwaffe. On the very same day that the German offensive began, Winston Churchill succeeded Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister. Churchill and his new coalition government were immediately faced with an unhappy and serious state of affairs. 28 German divisions were sweeping through the Low Countries toward France and the northern coast. The speed of the advance was staggering. The Germans were attacking on three fronts. Holland surrendered on the 14th of May, while Army Group B struck Belgium, and believing this to be the main German thrust, 10 divisions of what was called the British Expeditionary Force, along with the French 1st and 7th Armies, were sent north to meet them. They received a tremendous reception from the Belgians, cheering crowds everywhere. Bob Pendleton's unit was on exercise near the Somme when the invasion began. On hearing the news, they immediately moved forward into Belgium. "We got a tremendous reception from the Belgians," he recalled, cheering crowds everywhere. "We were amazed that the Germans made no effort to try and stop us." He paused, because, of course, they were thinking that we should go up there. It was a trap, and the British walked straight into it. While the BEF and the best French forces were drawn north into Belgium, the real German hammer blow was falling far to the south. The Allied forces soon realized that to the south, the Germans were also thundering through France. The French had always assumed that the Ardennes, the thick, forested hills along the Belgian-Luxembourg border, were impenetrable for tanks, and so their reserve army was stationed there. It broke rapidly under the blitzkrieg. The assumption that had underpinned the entire Allied defensive strategy was, in the space of days, proven fatally wrong. Georg Lehrmann and his regiment were part of that unstoppable advance. "We marched over Belgium," he recalled, "the Albert Canal, to the English Channel. The Albert Canal had been taken by a parachute unit jumping out from gliders, so we were able to march through without a problem." For the German soldiers, those early days must have felt like the war was already won. Bob Pendleton's unit moved up to the River Dyle, the first natural obstacle in front of the advancing Germans. There, they demolished bridges in the hope of slowing the onslaught, but the Allied armies were unable to halt the rapid German advance. By the 21st of May, the French and British forces had been completely separated, split in two by the speed and effectiveness of blitzkrieg. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. "We were told, to our amazement and bewilderment, that we were going to withdraw," Bob recalled. The French had apparently given way on our right flank. The Germans had broken through at Sedan and the Ardennes, and were racing towards the Channel ports. Our right flank was exposed. He took a breath, so off we set backwards. And that was the start of the withdrawal, which was to last a fortnight and take us to the beaches of Dunkirk. There was now the very real likelihood of a Belgian surrender, and the British were faced with the terrifying prospect of losing their access to the Channel ports, the lifeline of the British forces. Supplies were running low. There was little to be done. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, General Lord Gort, requested that the War Office make plans to evacuate his army from France. Gort selected Dunkirk as the place from which to rescue the British forces. The task of organizing the evacuation in Britain was given to Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the commander at Dover. It was codenamed Operation Dynamo. With that decision, the fate of an army, and perhaps of the war itself, would come down to a stretch of beach and whatever ships could be found to cross the Channel. But the men being asked to fight their way to that beach were in no shape for a grand campaign. Bob Pendleton's own experience told the story of Britain's unpreparedness in miniature. "When I came over here originally," he said, shaking his head at the memory, "I was issued with 12 bullets. 12. 4.5 bullets. I didn't have a gun, just the 12 bullets, and a motorcycle." He let that sink in. One Bren gun in a battalion, with nothing, and they were supposed to fight the Germans. Just impossible. This was the reality behind the official dispatches and the War Office communiques. An army sent to fight one of the most formidable military machines in history, equipped with almost nothing. The men knew it. Their officers knew it. And now, with the order to retreat, the only question was whether they could reach the coast before the Germans caught them. Ordered to retreat, the British troops began to fall back toward the coast. And as the soldiers withdrew, they found themselves sharing the roads with something that made the horror of war impossible to ignore: the refugees. Bob Pendleton had just met a girl called Simone in the Belgian town of Les Cans when the orders came through. The last time he saw her, she was with her mother and father, her father pulling a cart loaded with their belongings, joining the millions of civilians streaming away from the German advance. "I'll never forget that day," Bob said, his voice heavy even after 6 decades. "I thought afterwards, many times, that if I'd had my wits about me, she could have got dressed in soldier's clothes, and I could have taken her on the bike and got her across to England. But anyway, that's how it happened." It was a small, personal tragedy amid the vastness of the catastrophe. But it captures something essential about what Dunkirk meant to the people who lived through it, the haunting sense of what was lost, and the choices that could never be undone. The withdrawal itself was a nightmare. Night after night, the same grim routine. "We would withdraw during the night," Bob explained, "about an hour after everybody else had already left. So it was a very lonely business, waiting for an hour to elapse before you went withdrawing yourself, and then withdrawing through the darkness, terrified of losing your way. Arriving at a new position behind another river, digging in the early hours of the morning, and during part of the day, waiting for a German onslaught, and then doing exactly the same the following night. Every foot, every yard of ground was contested. The casualties among soldiers and civilians alike began to mount. The Stukas, the German dive bombers with their terrifying wailing sirens, came again and again, and their targets were not only soldiers. There was a great deal of bombing at this time, Bob recalled. Stuka dive bombing, but principally on the roads, against the refugees, which was a horrible sight. The bombs would come down, and they would run in all directions, and very often they would get hit, so that you would have women and children lying dead in the roadway, amidst all their belongings, over the very road which you had got to drive your trucks. And so you did your best to avoid running over everything, but it was just constant, all the way back to Dunkirk. The convoys were hit too, horses and men killed together in the same blasts, and all along the line of retreat, the evidence of an army in desperate flight. Georg Lehrmann saw it from the other side. The lorries, the guns, they weren't just left standing, he said. They had been tipped over, and from that you could tell that the men who had used them had needed to get away quickly. They'd been driven into ditches and tipped over. For one British soldier, the chaos of the retreat brought a moment he would never forget. He came upon a house full of wounded men, with a single soldier at the door. "Is there anything you can do for me?" the soldier asked. "I've got all these men in here. They're all wounded. I have no means of getting them away. I just don't know what to do about them." There was nothing to be done. It was not a nice feeling, the soldier admitted. Meanwhile, General Lord Gort withdrew the British forces to a final defensive position along the canal line of the rivers Yser, Scarpe, and Aue. He had hoped that help would come from the towns of Boulogne and Calais, but Boulogne fell into German hands on the 24th of May, and Calais, despite an epic defensive action by the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, was captured 2 days later. The position looked hopeless. Every channel port south of Dunkirk was now in enemy hands. There was one way out, and one way only. We didn't know what was going on, Bob admitted. I suspect that nobody did. And we were a bit scared of these Stukas that kept dropping the odd bomb here and there. But nevertheless, this disillusionment and fear, I don't think, in any way prevented us from carrying out our normal soldierly duties. Not all the encounters on the retreat were with the enemy. At one point, Bob came across 6 French soldiers, their rifles in hand. They stopped him. "Anglais party, they said the English are leaving." Bob protested. "No, we're here," but the Frenchmen were insistent. "Party, Dunkirk," they said. Bob was baffled. "I'd never even heard of Dunkirk," he recalled. "That was the first I knew about the evacuation. This would have been about 10 days before we got there. 10 days. 10 days of fighting, retreating, and marching toward a destination that most of the men on the ground didn't even know existed as a plan. 2 of Bob's comrades had stayed behind to blow up an obstacle, and as the charges went off, they could hear German troops marching down the road toward them. The 2 men hid in a ditch and covered themselves while the German soldiers marched past close enough to touch, close enough to hear the rhythm of their boots on the cobblestones. And then something remarkable happened, something that, even now, historians struggle to fully explain. This was a critical point in the evacuation. The unrelenting German attacks could have destroyed the Allied forces caught in northern France. The British had a powerful, seemingly unstoppable enemy in front of them, and the North Sea at their back. In Britain, there were dark predictions that perhaps only 50,000 men from the entire army could be saved. With more than 4 times that number of British troops in France, it did not look good. But Hitler made a key decision that helped the Allies in their retreat to Dunkirk. Because he needed to conquer the rest of France, Hitler wanted to rest his armies. On the 24th of May, he ordered a temporary halt to the Fourth Army's advance. They were to take 2 days to rest and resupply. It was a decision that has been debated ever since, and it gave the Allies a crucial breathing space. There was another factor behind the halt. Hermann Goering had assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe could destroy the Allied troops in the Dunkirk pocket on their own, from the air alone. It was a boast that would prove hollow, but at the time, Hitler believed it. Georg Lehrmann's regiment had been part of the relentless advance. "First of all, we saw the Stukas and the explosions from our artillery," he recalled. "But it didn't last long. It lasted about 2 hours. And then we had to stop firing, and I was given the order to drive into France. The halt had come, and with it, the slenderest of chances for the men in the pocket. Georg Lehrmann witnessed firsthand what the halt looked like from the German side. With the lull in fighting, the thoughts of some soldiers turned to darker impulses. In a town near the front, the consequences of indiscipline were made brutally clear. "We had a break for 4 hours one night," Georg recalled, "and in the morning we had to line up. One of our soldiers had forcibly raped a girl at gunpoint. We all gathered together at the town hall marketplace, and he was executed the same day. A measure to ensure that all soldiers knew what was going on, that during the war, such acts would be punished by death." During the unexpected respite, there were other crucial developments that helped the Allied cause. Captured German orders revealed a plan to attack in an area between Ypres and Menin, and General Gort was able to send reinforcements, thwarting a breakthrough that could have spelled disaster for the entire evacuation. And back in Britain, experts began to unlock the secrets of the captured Enigma coding machine, meaning that as the Germans rested, Gort was able to receive their decrypted messages. All of this helped ease some of the pressure on the Allies. But the men on the ground knew nothing of Enigma, nothing of high strategy, nothing of Hitler's hesitation. They only knew exhaustion. They knew the sound of Stukas. They knew the smell of burning oil and the taste of dust in their mouths. And they knew that every mile they marched brought them closer to either salvation or capture. "We were beginning to get really very tired," Bob said. "At the age of 18, 19, 20, you haven't got the stamina that you get later. And very difficult to keep awake." He recalled one night during the withdrawal when the entire column ground to a halt. He climbed out of his truck and walked forward to find his platoon sergeant and driver fast asleep in the cab. The war could wait, their bodies could not. By the time hostilities were fully resumed on the 27th of May, the Allied defensive positions around Dunkirk had been organized, and the first troops had already begun to sail for home. It was not before time. On that same day, Belgium formally surrendered. The ring was closing. Inside the defensive ring was a mass of seething humanity. 360,000 British, French, and Belgian troops, alongside more than 250,000 civilians, were packed into an area totaling less than 100 square miles. Military transports, trucks, tanks, and lorries lined the lanes and streets in their thousands. The air smelled of cordite and burning fuel. The constant crump of artillery merged with the scream of dive bombers overhead into a continuous wall of noise that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Bob Pendleton would never forget his first sight of it. It was like a vehicle scrapyard, he said. There were disabled vehicles lying on either side of the road, with barely room for people to get through. And it must be borne in mind that all this time, and with all this movement, we were hampered by the refugee columns streaming away from the Germans. Georg Lehrmann and his comrades saw the same chaos from the advancing German side. We saw the Stukas fly in, he recalled, and that the men had left everything lying around. We saw all the vehicles and the trains. Everything had been abandoned, so the men must have run away. We saw it all. The officers, he said, probably knew as little as the ordinary soldiers. But we were sent in. We were told we had to prevent the English departure. With the pocket gradually being reduced by German pressure, Bob was given a dangerous mission. He was ordered to go to Bergues, a town 10 miles from Dunkirk, to deliver a message telling the troops there to fall back. I came in over the bridge, over the grass verge, parked the bike, Bob recalled, his eyes distant with the memory. Looked around. Everything was on fire. It was devastating. Absolute chaos. Nothing moving. The whole town blazing. I had to get towels wrapped around my head. I used the canal to dampen the towels and wrap them around so I wasn't affected by it. I had to walk from the motorcycle to the town hall, get down to the cellars, get these men out, inform them that they had to get to Dunkirk the only way they could walking. And yet, even with the Allies in such disarray, the Germans seemed somehow to hold back. Why they didn't attack all parts of the Allied defenses more vigorously is a mystery that has endured for more than 6 decades. There is even one outlandish theory that to secure a swift peace agreement with the British, Hitler deliberately allowed them to make their dramatic escape. Whether that theory holds water or not, the fact remains. The Germans made rapid inroads to the south, but strangely, in the center and to the north, they hardly advanced at all. As the men moved toward Dunkirk, they navigated by 2 things. We knew where it was for 2 reasons, one soldier recalled. We could see the pall of smoke emanating from the burning oil refinery. And also, quite honestly, you could just follow the Stukas all the way to Dunkirk, follow the bombers to safety. There was a grim logic to it. I felt they were about 8 or 9 miles away, Bob said. I thought they'd just come through and capture us and take us, because we had nothing to defend ourselves with. It was just a matter of waiting for them to appear. He paused, and the silence of the memory settled over him. But they never appeared. To this day, I cannot explain it. We had nothing, no guns, no ammunition, no hope of reinforcement. They could have walked through us like a knife through butter, but they never came. Not everyone was so fortunate. One of my best friends, who I joined the army with, got killed holding the bridgehead while we evacuated, Bob said quietly. So not everyone got away from Dunkirk. From the 26th of May, the great rescue of the Allied forces at Dunkirk began. While British and French troops fought to defend the town itself, a remarkable fleet of ships had arrived off the French coast to ferry the besieged troops back to Britain. The British Admiralty had realized early on that to evacuate more than 200,000 troops from Dunkirk, it would need a far larger fleet than was currently available. And so a desperate appeal went out to all owners of small boats to come to the aid of the Royal Navy. This flotilla of little ships made Dunkirk the stuff of legend. Every conceivable type of sailing craft, yachts, fishing boats, pleasure boats, steam packets, and barges turned up on the south coast or in the Thames estuary to help with the evacuation. The fleet included more than 40 British, French, Belgian, and Dutch warships of all types, destroyers, minesweepers, sloops, personnel ships, all come to aid their allies in their desperate hour of need. And of course, there were the famous little ships, more than 900 of them, in all shapes and sizes. But for the little ships, this was certainly no pleasure cruise. From the skies above came the German dive bombers and machine gun fire. From the shore came the shells of the German artillery. Georg Lehrmann was in one of those artillery regiments, and he had been ordered to prevent the Allied evacuation. What he saw, what he was ordered to do, haunts him still. "I'll be honest," Georg said, and his voice cracked even after all those years. "I cried when they said that we should fire into the men. You can't do that. They had no weapons, nothing at all, and we were able to fire with artillery. We had rifles. The infantry was there as well. They had no means of defense. They had thrown away their weapons. They weren't running around defending themselves. They were on the beach, trying to reach the boats." Those words carry a weight that no military history can quite convey. A young German soldier, weeping at the orders he had been given, firing on men who could not fire back. It is one of the most honest and devastating testimonies to come out of Dunkirk from either side. The whole episode, Georg would say later, filled him even today with great shame. "I hate it," he said simply. "This place was absolutely full of bodies, men lying about, some walking into the sea. Our guns were trained on the fleeing people who couldn't defend themselves anymore, and we fired on them like crazy." He paused, searching for words. "I've no idea why. And what of the men on the receiving end of that fire? What was it like to stand on a beach with no weapon, no cover, and no certainty that you would ever leave?" Remarkably, the veterans recall not panic, but a strange numbness. "We didn't see panic," one soldier said. "Panic didn't exist. Everybody was too frightened to panic, I think. Too frightened to panic." It is a phrase that captures the peculiar psychology of extreme danger, the point at which fear becomes so total that it circles back around to a kind of frozen calm. On the beaches, the scene was barely controlled chaos. "You came eventually in sight of the sea," Bob recalled, "and there was this great pall of smoke to our left, which was Dunkirk, the oil tanks blazing. And then in front, there were great lines of soldiers, up to their waists, their necks, stretching into the sea. There were queues and queues of men waiting to embark. The area was being bombed constantly." Bob and his companions moved about 500 yards down the beach, dug into the sand dunes, and waited. "The first thing we all wanted was some sleep," he said. "So we got into the sand dunes and we went to sleep. And people often say to me, how awful the dive bombing must have been. We slept through it. I think we must have slept for about 24 hours. We were so tired. 24 hours, asleep on a beach under German bombardment. That single detail tells you more about the state of those men than any casualty report ever could. The footage that survives from those days, and the photographs taken by those who were there, show scenes that are at once chaotic and eerily orderly. Long lines of men standing in the surf, waiting their turn. Boats capsized in the shallows, columns of black smoke rising from the burning port behind them, and everywhere, the detritus of an army in retreat, rifles stacked on the sand, helmets floating in the waves, vehicles driven into the sea as makeshift jetties. Meanwhile, Georg watched from the dunes on the German side. "We stood up here and watched the men trying to get away in the boats," he said, "and it was difficult. They couldn't land properly. They had to go into the water and then into the boats, and that took time. The Stukas arrived in waves. The same ones flew over repeatedly," Georg recalled. "All we heard was the wailing siren. It dived and boomed. For the men on the beach with no cover and no weapons, each attack was an exercise in pure terror. And yet there were also moments of dark, absurd comedy amid the carnage." One soldier waiting on the beach remembered the scene. "I remember coming across a French soldier who had obviously just been in a bombing raid. He had one eyeball hanging down his cheek, and he was screaming for help, and I was not much good at coping with a situation like that. Even those who made it onto the ships were not safe. Some soldiers who thought they had reached safety soon found it was a case of out of the frying pan, into the fire. A couple of destroyers came ashore," one veteran recalled, "and we joined the queue of men embarking. However, we chose the wrong one. Hardly had we set sail when it was hit, a direct hit from an aircraft. The entire forecastle was blown out. We were fortunately on the deck, and many men were wounded. However, another destroyer, HMS Malcolm, came alongside, and we were able to throw the wounded across. Eventually, we scrambled across ourselves, and we set sail. The most successful day of the evacuation was the 30th of May, when 53,000 men were ferried back to Britain. Many small ships made the journey across the channel several times, back and forth through the bombardment. The sailors of those privately owned volunteer craft put their lives on the line. By the time the evacuation officially ended on the 4th of June, Nearly 250 of the small craft had been destroyed, almost a third of those that had taken part. The human cost was written in the faces of the men who waited, faces blackened with smoke and oil, eyes hollow with exhaustion, uniforms soaked through from hours standing in the surf. Georg saw what was happening and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but futility. All they wanted was to get away, he said. Get away from the beaches and get over to England. That was the main thing. There were so many men. It was just impossible to move without them, loads of them, all over the place. And then, with the quiet honesty that defined his testimony, everyone realized that it was senseless. The men at the guns didn't see it, but the infantrymen they stopped, and I noticed that less and less guns were firing. In the midst of this desperate evacuation, the troops maintained an almost superhuman discipline, even though for some it was 3 days before they were able to leave the shore. One officer recalled meeting the adjutant of his battalion on the beach. "Good to see you," the adjutant said. "Right. Get your platoon off. Back to England now." The officer asked the obvious question, "How do I do that?" The adjutant's reply was magnificently unhelpful. "Use your initiative." But before Bob Pendleton could leave the Dunkirk beaches, his brigadier gave him one last message to deliver, this time to the British troops still holding the defensive line. It was time for them to leave and get to the beaches. Bob rode his motorcycle up to a farm where the troops were supposed to be. There was no sign of anyone except the farmer and his family. He went back and reported, "They're not there," he told the brigadier. The reply came, "Well, they must have retired. Try again." So Bob went back. He turned right at the junction, and there, 50 yards away, was the advance guard of the German SS, machine guns, armored cars, everything. "I didn't take any more to do," Bob said. "I turned that bike down very, very quickly and made sure they weren't following me." He got back to the brigadier. "Well, I know they're not there now," he reported. "Why?" "Because the Germans are there." The brigadier nodded. "We can now go to Dunkirk." And then there is the story of the Padre, one of those moments that, even amid the horror, reminds you that war is also a profoundly human experience, full of absurdity and dark comedy. A group of soldiers had set off in a small boat, rowing toward a destroyer they could see silhouetted against the night sky. They were about 400 yards away when they heard the anchor chain coming up. The destroyer was turning. It was leaving without them. A padre who was sitting in the middle of the boat leaped to his feet, flung his arms wide to the heavens, and shouted, "Lord, Lord, why hast thou forsaken us?" And 40 soldiers as one voice shouted, "Sit down," because as he leaped to his feet, the boat rocked violently. Water came sloshing over the sides, and that great shout echoed across the water to the destroyer. It came to a stop. Whether it was God or 40 angry soldiers, something had been heard. By nightfall on the 1st of June, real and spectacular progress had been made. Only 3 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force remained ashore. By the following day, they had all been evacuated. The defenses around the town were being manned only by French troops, who fought doggedly on against the great tide of the German army. It was only a matter of time before they were engulfed completely. Their sacrifice, holding the line while the last British soldiers were taken off, deserves to be remembered alongside the little ships and the beaches. Without the French rearguard, thousands more men would have been lost. On the 3rd and 4th of June, British ships returned to rescue as many as possible. Bob Pendleton was among the very last to leave. His escape was worthy of a film. The pier had been blown apart, a 10-foot gap where the structure had been destroyed. Soldiers had bridged it with planks they had found. Bob rode his motorcycle across the makeshift bridge, then let the bike go into the sea. "I tried to climb down the pier," he said. "These broad beams, very slippery. I did about 5 trips on a motorcycle, and then I slipped about halfway down and I fell. And the fishermen caught me into the boat." He paused. "And that's how we got away." Some French fishing trawlers were the only vessels that could still get in the pier. It was full of blazing ships. It was chaos to the very end. Inevitably, Dunkirk fell, and the final troops were evacuated on the 4th of June. Even so, some 40,000 Frenchmen were left behind, men who had fought bravely to hold the perimeter, who had expected to be evacuated alongside their British allies, and who now faced years of captivity. Their abandonment would poison Anglo-French relations for years to come. But Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, had been a success beyond anyone's darkest expectations in late May. The initial prediction had been that perhaps 50,000 men could be saved. In the end, it was incredible that 338,226 Allied troops had been borne to safety across the Channel. 139,000 of these were French and Belgian soldiers. It was, by any measure, an astonishing achievement, a logistical miracle conjured from chaos by the courage of ordinary sailors and the stubbornness of soldiers who refused to die. The men came home to England, and the first thing many of them remember is not the relief, not the joy, but a cup of tea and a jam sandwich. "We felt thoroughly demoralized and awful," one soldier admitted. "We'd run away. Our fathers had fought for 4 long years in France and had never given way, and we'd been in action for a fortnight. We had hardly seen any real fighting. The shame was real, and it was deep." These men knew the truth of what had happened, even as the newspapers were calling it a miracle. And then came the speech that changed how many of them felt. The men were marched to a gymnasium and told to sit on the floor. There was a gallery overlooking them, and out onto it strode a full colonel with a red cap. "Welcome home. Heroes of the BEF," he declared. And the men thought, heroes? They looked at each other, dirty, thin, ashamed, and the words seemed to belong to a different army entirely. But the colonel went on, at some length, about what a wonderful show they had put up against overwhelming odds. He spoke of courage and duty and sacrifice, and by the end of it, the veteran recalled, "We really felt very much better, so that, in fact, when we eventually got home on leave, we were greeted everywhere as heroes." He paused, but I knew, in my heart of hearts, we weren't heroes at all. No matter how the returning troops felt, there was understandable joy and relief throughout Great Britain that so many had escaped. But harsh reality soon tempered the euphoria. The country was now at the mercy of the Germans. Although Britain's army had been delivered virtually intact, almost all of its equipment was still in France, in the hands of the enemy. The numbers were devastating. All tanks and transport had been lost. 2,500 guns, 70,000 vehicles, 500,000 tons of ammunition, all of it left in the wreckage of Dunkirk. If the Germans had launched an invasion of Britain in those weeks, the island would have had almost nothing with which to defend itself. The soldiers were home, but the tools of war were scattered across the fields and roads of northern France. Dunkirk had been a victory to boost morale, but little else. The saga also did little for Anglo-French relations. The Vichy government that was soon established in France coined the phrase perfidious Albion, accusing Britain of abandoning its allies in an all-out attempt to save its own army. Many think this an unfounded slur that denigrated the heroic efforts of the evacuation fleet and insulted the memory of those who had given their lives. Winston Churchill attempted to calm Britain's euphoric mood. "Wars are not won by evacuations," warned the new Prime Minister, as he tried to prepare the country for the dark days ahead. He was right, of course. The months that followed would bring the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and the long, grinding years of a war that was far from over. But Churchill also understood something else, that Dunkirk had given the nation something it desperately needed. Not a victory, but a story. A story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. A story of survival against the odds. A story that, true or not in all its details, would sustain a country through its darkest hours. For the men who had been there, the story was more complicated. They knew the chaos, the fear, the shame of retreat. They knew about the friends who didn't make it back. They knew about the 40,000 Frenchmen left behind. They knew that Dunkirk was not a victory, it was the narrowest of escapes from total catastrophe. But they also knew something else. They knew what it felt like to be standing on a beach at the edge of the world, with nothing between them and oblivion but a stretch of gray water and the courage of the men who sailed across it to bring them home. The events at Dunkirk were truly extraordinary, and those who lived through them have never forgotten. "Frightening but uplifting," one veteran said. "Uplifting because of the spirit of the people on the beaches," another recalled. Everyone talked about the miracle of Dunkirk, and it seemed to be a miracle that so many of us got off. It was a miracle the water was so calm that the weather was good, and that the Germans didn't try to launch their final killer blow, which they could have done so easily. Georg Lehrmann, standing on the beaches where he once fired on defenseless men, spoke carefully. "This is the first time I've been back," he said. "And for me there are, of course, good and bad memories. I look at it like this. The war was not necessary. We didn't know why the war took place." Bob Pendleton, walking beside the man who had once been his enemy, reflected on what Dunkirk had meant. "I looked on it as though we'd been defeated in France," he said, "which we were. And then afterwards, as the war went on, You realized that you were going to win eventually. That was a great feeling. The war went on, of course. After Dunkirk came the battles that shaped the future of the world. Normandy, El Alamein, Monte Cassino, the Ardennes. Men who had been implacable enemies would one day meet at the scenes of those epic struggles. But Dunkirk was where it began for the British, at least. It was their first great test, and they had failed it in every military sense. And yet from that failure had come something extraordinary, a story of rescue and resilience that became the foundation of everything that followed. Two old men on a beach, one English, one German. More than 60 years since they stood on opposite sides of a catastrophe, walking together now, in the quiet of a French afternoon, sharing memories that most people can barely imagine. 338,226 men were saved at Dunkirk. But Dunkirk was never just about the numbers. It was about the men who queued in the water for hours, under fire, waiting for boats that might never come. It was about the sailors who crossed and recrossed the channel through bombs and shells. It was about a German artilleryman who wept at the orders he was given. It was about a signalman who lost a girl called Simone and never forgot her. It was about soldiers who slept for 24 hours under dive bombers because their bodies simply gave out. It was about a Padre who stood up in a boat and nearly capsized it, and 40 men who shouted him down, and a destroyer that stopped. It was about a motorcycle ridden across a broken pier and dropped into the sea. It was about a jam sandwich at Ramsgate that tasted like the finest meal a man had ever eaten. Dunkirk was a defeat. It was a miracle. It was a disgrace. It was a triumph. It was all of these things at once, and it was the moment when Britain looked total disaster in the face and somehow, improbably, impossibly, got away. The men who lived through it carried the memory for the rest of their lives, not as heroes, not as victims, but as witnesses to something that should never have happened and as proof that even in the darkest hour, the human will to survive can find a way. Because that is the truth of Dunkirk. It was not glorious, it was not clean, but it was real. And in its desperate, chaotic, heartbreaking reality, it became something that no one had planned, and no one expected, a story that an entire nation would cling to in the years of darkness that followed. A story of a signalman on a motorcycle, riding through burning towns to deliver messages that might already be too late. A story of a German artilleryman who wept at his own orders. A story of fishermen and yachtsmen who sailed into hell and brought an army home. And perhaps that is the real miracle. Not that the army was saved, but that in the saving of it, something else was preserved, something harder to define, but just as vital. A belief that even when everything has gone wrong, when the enemy is at the gates and the sea is at your back, there is still a reason to keep going. There is still a reason to hope. The beaches of Dunkirk are quiet now. The tide comes in and goes out, as it always has. The sand that once ran red has been washed clean a million times over. The piers have been rebuilt, the buildings restored, the scars of war smoothed away by time and the patient work of reconstruction. Tourists come in summer. Children build sandcastles. It is a place of peace. But if you listen carefully, in the wind off the channel, you can almost hear them, the voices of the men who were here. The shouts, the prayers, the silence after the guns, the roar of engines and the crash of waves against the hulls of small boats, the crackle of burning oil and the distant thud of artillery. They echo still, because some places remember, even when the world forgets. And Dunkirk, this quiet, ordinary beach town on the northern coast of France, will remember forever.